Okay, so now I'm recording. So I will begin. And the first thing I wanted to do actually was just very briefly share share my screen with you. Hopefully, can everybody see the images there? Because in the paper I speak about a possible tendency to disembody the actors, the participants, the people that are present in secret police archives. And so that I don't completely disembody them as well, I have the option of just showing you quickly this page from a file that shows the participants in a group that were under surveillance in Romania. Just really to give an indication that they were people with faces and bodies and so on. And they're represented in the archive materially as well as just textually. But I'm going to start off reading my paper, but I might well switch to just kind of describing what's there after a short while. So the title is Feasting and Fasting, the Evidential Character of Material Religion in the Secret Police Archives. During the decades of communism, both the regimes within the region and scholars of religion who were overwhelmingly outside of the region were engaged with the same question: how socialist modernity was impacting on religion, and whether the expected demise of religion, whether it's due to benign forces of secularization or under the pressure of atheist education, propaganda, and repression, and so on, would prove terminal to religion. So whether wished for or lamented, the assumption was that religion was in terminal decline in the Soviet Union and its satellite states, just as it was understood to be in the West due to the forces of secularization. But as Sonia Lerman notes, since that time, the basic assumptions that ground the debate have shifted, and in the post-communist context, we can now bring new questions to the problem of religion under communism and to our expectations of the documents bequeathed to us by communist regimes. In recent years, interest in historical processes has begun to be eclipsed by a concern for the cultural and political role of memory, a concern which has also become pressing for scholars of contemporary religions. Nevertheless, the persistence of religion under hostile regimes and the state-sponsored secularization remains an important question for scholars of religions, not least because, as Chris Hann observes, if we want to find satisfactory answers to our questions regarding the contemporary post-communist context, our inquiries cannot proceed without careful reassessment of the transmission of religious beliefs and practices in the socialist era. As we know, the study of religion was at best difficult and at worst impossible during the socialist period, and that's a quote from Douglas Rogers. So in this chapter, I suggest that in the absence of ethnographic research at the time, we can approach the question of transmission through the exploration of the material aspects of religion as represented in secret police archives. When viewed through a material lens, that the texts and images in the archives can offer us insights into the realities of life in the religious underground that have thus far not been explored. And although not qualitatively the same as ethnographic sources, they represent surrogates of performances in a similar way to ethnographic field notes. As Agnes Hess elsewhere has observed, by shifting our viewpoint and applying alternative methodological apparatus, namely those of the scholars of religions rather than the historian of communism or of the secret police, the archives of the former secret police can offer up data that is both intriguing and illuminating. Over the past decade, scholarship on religions, influenced by broader trends in the social sciences and humanities, has increasingly started exploring the significance of materiality. This has been termed the so-called material turn, and has inspired renewed interest in practices, spaces, bodies, landscapes, sensory and lived experiences, and their intersection with non-human agencies. Now, the secret police archives offer or contain a wealth of sources that refer to, represent, reproduce, and capture in images these aspects of material lived religion. The archival record comes in many forms. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all, the wealth of different types of materials there, not only the informers reports and interrogation reports and so on, but also all these other aspects of material religion that are represented there. So despite the epistemological and ethical challenges associated with such sources, They constitute one of the few sets of historical data available to researchers seeking to understand lived religion during communism. And due to the lack of ethnological or anthropological studies at the time, this material religion in the Secret Police archives represents a crucial entry point for lived religion during communism. So in this chapter, or sorry, in this paper, I'm going to explore one aspect of material religion relating to a religious community in 1950s and 1960s Romania, as reflected in the Secret Police record. As Graham Harvey, who's a well-known scholar of religions, indigenous religions and contemporary religious movements, argues, food and the abstention from food is central to religious acts. And this is certainly the case with regards to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Practices associated with food, referred to by anthropologists and scholars of religion often as food ways, are extremely important in Orthodox Christianity for individual, spiritual, communal, and economic life. There are multiple occasions when special foods are prepared and consumed, including commemorations of the dead, funerals and requiem feasts, when pomana, or special gifts, are given for the forgiveness of sins or salvation of souls. Their special foods are prepared, again, notably koliva, which is a special food prepared for these feasts and festivals. There are a number of complex and diverse fasting rules and traditions that many Orthodox followers follow. These include obligatory periodic fasts associated with festivals, and also fasts on certain days of the week. In addition to this, there are also important distribution networks of special types of foods through charitable activities, food exchange practices, something called milostenie, which is the giving of charitable gifts for religious foundations and monasteries and so on. And not least, of course, amongst the ways in which food is engaged within the community is the act of communion itself, the Holy Mystery of the Eucharist, or Împărtășenie in Romanian, which also requires the special acquisition, preparation and consecration of foodstuffs. So I argue here that the distribution and consumption of foodstuffs for feasting and fasting form an important aspect of the way the religious underground network under discussion functioned and the way it was constituted, both maintaining and structuring social relations within the group and serving as an important medium through which relations with the world were also negotiated. The community, were often referred to the world as everybody else. The insiders were the community, and then the flock and the world. For the religious community discussed in this chapter, food represented a crucial economic support for their leaders, a source of communal cohesion, a spiritual support, as well as, and this is the most interesting aspect from my perspective, a spiritual weapon that could be used against the regime. On the other hand, the attention that the secret police placed on the foodways of the religious community under discussion, on one level, could be taken simply as an illustration of the significance that the regime itself placed on material and economic means by which communities could sustain themselves, and therefore were of interest to them and could be targeted. And for us as scholars, they might indicate the way in the secret police archives that religion was kind of confined within this ideological frame, a materialist ideological frame. I'll return to this a little bit later. But I argue here that the archival record can speak on a number of other levels that reveal the centrality of this aspect of religious life for the community, beyond the regime's accusations of black market activity or parasitism or economic exploitation, and offer us important insights into the cultural complex that was religious life in the underground. The material evidence of religion, as reported and presented by officers, agents, and informers, as problematic as it may be, needs to be assessed as integral to the wider cultural context and the lived experience of all involved, especially the insiders who were also sometimes informers, and vice versa, and not only as part of the ideological discursive frame of the regime. Making material religion evidential, and this is a term that comes from David Morgan, a scholar of contemporary religions, so making material religion evidential through the secret police archives, as in all other social and historical settings, requires foregrounding images, emotions, sensations, spaces, food, dress, or the material practices of putting the body to work. So in other words, in order for the texts and images in the archive to speak full of the complexity of lived realities, we need to take special care and intentional methodological steps so as not to disembody the characters and past lives we encounter in the archives, hence me showing you the image to try and keep that present at all times. So in the case I present below, the food ingested into the archival record speaks as part of a cultural life world situated within a broader socioeconomic realities of 1950s and 1960s Romania. As Sonia Lerman, one of the few scholars who's worked specifically on religion in Soviet archives, asserts, documents can and do contain valid insights that do more than simply perpetuate an existing regime of truth. The secret police archives, as this chapter seeks to illustrate, sometimes ingested objects, materials, cultural practices that could not be digested into the knowledges and truths intended by the regime and by the secret police archive. And this again is one of the kind of important points I wanted to make, is that the archive, you know, was part of a process, and things ended up in the archive that, you know, couldn't be entirely digested or controlled by the regime when the meaning and uses of the archive changed in the post-communist context. Okay, so I'm now going to speak a little bit in general about material religion and the secret police archives and approaches to archives. So in general, material approaches to social phenomena, which have in large part grown out of the disciplines of archaeology and anthropology, can be understood to represent an implicit critique of approaches that reduce the material world to the effect of discourses, expressions of signs or symbols, ideas or ideologies. They reflect the ongoing dissatisfaction with the constructivist approaches born out of the Derridian and Foucauldian traditions which earlier had laid the groundwork for the archival turn in the social sciences and humanities, as well as post-structuralist and post-colonial approaches to the archive. In addition, the transformational influence of the archival turn, which emphasized the archive as an expression and instrument of governmental control, roughly coincided with the opening of the archives in communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and has proved pivotal for the contemporary analysis of mechanisms of control exercised over populations through the production of knowledge. So what I'm getting at here is the implicit critique of constructivist approaches to the archives that grows out of the material turn. So we had an archival turn, which is this kind of Foucauldian constructivist turn, and now a material turn that implicitly, not always explicitly, but implicitly critiques the way that texts, and archival texts in particular, are become disembodied from material realities and material existence. So when researching religion in the secret police archives, a solely constructivist approach misses important traces that can offer us a fuller and embodied understanding of religion during communism. Again, as Graham Harvey notes, in the past, scholars of religion, or the study of religions, has tended to emphasize ideas and beliefs, largely drawn from texts, and cognitive processes over religion as lived. This bias of scholars of religions has contributed to a reluctance to see the secret police archives as a valuable and reliable source of data for research on religion per se. The ubiquitous misrepresentations of motivations, false interpretations of religious beliefs, and distorted presentations of religious practices suggest that the data on religions in the secret police archives may only be useful for studies focusing instead on the discursive processes deployed in the aim of social control. But as Zeitlin, who's written a really excellent summary chapter on the anthropology of archives, notes, despite Foucault and Derrida both themselves recognizing the potential for the archive to disrupt and subvert the hegemonic system that it created, this has been overshadowed by the implied impossibility of escaping the evidential purpose or intention of the archive. So again, what I'm talking about here is how do we recover from Foucauldian and Derridian approaches this potential for subversion of the archive by reading it in a different way. So a number of approaches have been developed with the aim of uncovering voices lost or silenced by bureaucratic and colonial archives. Just to mention a couple of them, Komarov and Komarov have advocated reading the archive against the grain. This is quite a well-known approach, by using traces external to the archive to interpret archival documents and recover lost voices. While Stoller, again, a much cited approach, reading the archive along the grain in order to grasp the biases and preoccupations of the curators of archival documents. Both propose that reading the archival documents in certain ways can retrieve seemingly lost or subjugated subaltern voices. In a similar vein, and I'm quoting Sonia Lerman quite a lot because she is one of the people that, that's written extensively on religion in socialist archives. Sonia describes her attempts to pierce through the layers of rhetoric and standard formulae in Soviet documents in the hope of being able to filter out facts about religious life. And so she's explicitly rejecting the idea that communist archives speak only of the internal workings of Soviet state bureaucracies. These approaches, which recognize, and I'm quoting Zeitlin again, that a record may be created for one purpose but used to other ends, accepts that the archive can become a means by which traces that were never intended to form conscious historical remains can bear witness in the future. And there, my use of the word traces, I'm referencing Assmann. Speaking more broadly about cultural memory and acts of remembering and forgetting, Assmann makes some pertinent points with regards to the nature and content of political archives. Highlighting the means by which acts of forgetting are enacted, which although often, and again to quote Assmann, although often violently destructive when directed at an alien culture or a persecuted minority, are not always successful instruments in destroying material and cultural mental products. So we're reminded that violent attempts to subjugate knowledges, cultures and identities during communism largely proved unsuccessful, and the persistence of religions attests to this, as with several other cultural forms that survived the communist period. So in the case of the communist regime's attempts to destroy or obliterate religion, the archives of the secret police have paradoxically become the place where traces of persecuted groups have remained. And as already mentioned, the folders and documents of the archives contain between their covers a rich collection of confiscated items such as photographs, religious art, pamphlets, diaries, poetry, hymns, and so on. And apart from the mission to incriminate or control and eliminate certain religious groups, the secret police archives preserve this visual and material traces of otherwise invisible or clandestine communities. Now, another thing that's important to understand is, if we're trying to, if we're thinking about marginalized groups in particular, I think the Hidden Galleries project, which Anka is also part of, and Julian, who's listening in today, has produced a very sizable body of evidence to demonstrate that the secret police archives produced particularly significant quantities or number of records in relation to communities that themselves were not necessarily focused on producing, their own historical record. So we have cases where, communities at the time were eschewed, a kind of record taking and a kind of historical approach to their own traditions, and yet nevertheless were preserved in the secret police archives. And today, some of those archival records are proving to be very valuable to the communities themselves in a process of retrieval. So in the post-communist context, precisely those communities that were least likely to preserve their history had their history preserved by the secret police, and that now is becoming active in the kind of recovery or memory process. Okay. So related to these ideas, sorry, just I skipped a bit there. Okay. Sorry, I'm confusing myself here. Okay, so these kind of unintended traces that remain there in the archive and self-representations in many cases have the possibility to destabilize the power of the archive and the dominant historical narratives that have emerged from them. So these diverse texts, objects and photographs in the Secret Police archives offer the possibility of multiple methodological approaches and modes of interpretation. Exploring such materials against the intentions of the Secret Police allows alternative histories to emerge from the epistemological fissure that separates texts from embodied lives, images, photographs and objects. In Assmann's terms, to go back to her account, if you like, of the relationship between memory and archives, due to the revolutionary break with the communist past that happened in 1989 to 1991, the Secret Police archives changed their identity and shifted from being active political archives to historical archives. Now, this distinction, however, when applied to the archives of the former Secret Police in Eastern Europe, obscures their political uses in the present. They do not, as Assmann asserts, store information which is no longer of immediate use, but are actually the active concern of political interests and memory projects in the present. The constructivist approaches, ironically, which I've discussed above and critiqued slightly, when applied by contemporary historians and political scientists to communist archives, have helped us to understand the enduring power of archives to shape contemporary political, cultural and religious realities and to structure historical memory. And this is my point. Perhaps they've done that more effectively than historians of religion have been able to use the archives to understand historical questions that Chris Hand and Sonia Lerman and others have identified as being important if we want to understand religion in communism. So what I'm saying here, is probably not very eloquently, is that the discursive constructivist approach to the archives helps us with the present more than it helps us with the past. And so we need to seek new tools for the historian when we're actually trying to deal with the historical questions and not the memory project or the kind of political memory questions that tend to have come to consume the historical readings of the archives. So this discrepancy in terms of the value and use of the archives can be accredited to the failures of historians to view the archive as a participant in the active process of religious transmission. Now, Sonia Lerman came close to this perspective when she points towards the documents in the archives as crucial nodes in nets of relations that can alert us to the realities other than the textual truths of the Secret Police. The materiality of the archives, in her words, present traces of the social relationships from which they emerged. And in light of this, she encourages us to pay attention to how, where, and when human actors met, occupied the same spaces, interacted, socialized, and exchanged words and goods. In other words, to their temporal, spatial, and somatic presence. Numerous real people contributed to the assembled text, images, and folders in the archives, from case officers, undercover agents, informers, administrators, commanding officers, as well as the targets themselves, either directly or indirectly through their recorded comments, through their fingerprints, signatures, and materials that were confiscated from them. So each of these traces, of course, potentially could have been fabricated or distorted. But through their totality, through their multivocality, through their complexity, and I'm quoting Catherine Verdery here, and I add their materiality, they reveal much more than they distort if we approach them as records of performed embodied action. When religion, which in most circumstances has this inherently performative character, constitutes the object of study stroke surveillance, this complex archival assemblage of human agencies is perhaps even more apparent than in relation to other social and cultural spheres. Now, I'm not a researcher of those other social and cultural spheres, so I wouldn't know in terms of literary history or sort of artist associations and so on, whether that's very accurate. But all I do know is that, you know, religion is inherently performative in nature, especially when you're trying to explore how it's transmitted through generations and through time. So relates to
you might want to know that you're speaking already almost 30 minutes, just for your information.
Really? Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm only gonna deliver the kind of this methodological part, and then I'm gonna give one example from the empirical examples. Okay, and I won't read this bit now, I'll just try and explain. So given this performative nature of religion and the way that anthropologists usually operate through the production of field notes, observations, and so on, which have been considered by, there's a very important sort of scholar of archives, indigenous archives in colonial the Americas, Diana Taylor. She talks about surrogates. So the anthropologist produces a surrogate, and those archival records, the archival records of the anthropologists, are similar to those of, I argue, to those of the informer, especially the insider informer. So somebody that was embedded for a long period of time and was possibly an insider group member. In producing surrogates of the performances, which can be read as such in a similar way that we might go back to Malinowski's or Boas's anthropological records and mine them for contemporary research. And an important point which I make, and that is also made by Catherine Verdery, is that many informers were in fact really quite good ethnographers. So they described their context, their environments in great detail, and they also, you know, as I said, they were many times insiders to the community, so they understood the significance of different cultural elements. Okay. So skipping forward, there's one other important point which should be made for scholars of religion. Anka and Juliana are here as well, so they'll probably grasp this. But in the study of religions, you know, the phenomenological tradition dominated for a long time, and the phenomenological tradition introduced to scholars of religion the idea of bracketing out truths, which comes from a kind of Husserlian philosophy of being able to, you know, separate out truth claims from your analysis. Now, this has been critiqued by many scholars of religion, but I argue that in a way it prepares scholars of religions to bracket out the ideological truth claims that are in secret police archives when exploring religious questions, because that move, if you like, that temporary move is part of the sort of the methodology of the study of religions, whereas it might not be so embedded within the kind of methodological tradition of some historians. Okay, so my empirical examples relate to a community from Romania, and what they do is they lay out how foodways played an important role in regulating social relationships within the group, and how this was picked up by the informers and reported in the secret police archives. And interestingly, those foodways, as in Orthodox Christianity, they're important for maintaining social cohesion, exchange, reciprocal exchange within communities, all of the things that we're familiar with, perhaps as scholars of religion, of the way that food and ritual operate, fasting and feasting. But interestingly, in the case of the Inacentis in Romania, food was used also as a means to reach out beyond the community and influence the wider world by counter-infiltrating the police and the authorities through their wives. And I have a nice quote, which I will read to you from an informer in relation to that one particular example. Okay, so this is an informer who had been embedded within the group for several years, so not really an outsider, an insider informer, reporting on an account given by a member of the community to him. And he says, and I also tell you that Tatiku, who was the spiritual leader of the community, has in his flock different types of people: doctors, officers, teachers. Brother, talking to his brother in the community, he has lots of officers and party members, wives whose husbands know nothing about him. But you should know, Brother John, that they are blessed by him. And I will tell you how, brother. Tatiku and Mamika, who are the leaders of the community, together with the nuns, they do the mass and they consecrate the bread of the host and they give it to the sisters whose husbands don't know anything, just how I'm telling you. And those sisters have asked the Father to put the blessed bread in the food, and they eat and they also drink the holy water as prepared by the Father, and they put it in their drinks and they drink it and they eat it and they are blessed. And this is how they do it. And this is how they do it, basically, this is how they, you know, they prevent the community being destroyed. Now, there are a number of other examples which are in the paper I circulated, where the significance of the maintenance of the food network, especially special foods such as fish, because the community didn't eat any kind of meat, was managed, and the miraculous stories that circulate around that. Also, the way in which someone becomes a member of the community by gift giving, and then entering into the community, and then becoming a person that redistributes the gifts. And so, counter to the secret police rather ineffectively tried to portray the group as, pursuing kind of economic exploitation and duping their followers who were ignorant and poorly educated and so on. So all of the usual sort of communist tropes. But the informers actually do quite a good job of revealing that the significance of food, which the secret police were reporting upwards because they thought that demonstrated the kind of dark kind of economic exploitation side, actually was a really, really important means by which the community communicated, by which the community self-cohered, and by which the community interacted and influenced the outside world. Now, the other argument I make in the paper, which isn't fully developed yet, is that, and as I said at the start, that we need to situate these things, in the wider context. And in this case, the context is 1950s and 60s Romania. So there are important changes in terms of food that took place in 1950s and 60s Romania, namely the move from rural communities mainly eating mamaliga, which is the kind of polenta, and replaced with factory produced bread in cities and small towns. And the Hungarian Revolution and its aftermath, and how this is reflected in the question of food security amongst the community and in its eschatological worldview. And my time is probably up. I won't read the long example, but I have a wonderful account of how the community situates itself and its spiritual father in relation to the impending apocalypse, the worries over grain being transported out of Romania when everybody is relying on grain and bread, and that the lack of bread in towns when people have to go to travel to town to work, and how the spiritual father, Tantegu, through his distribution of the corn de prăjitură, which is like the kind of the bread used to prepare for the host, is distributing it to the community and saving them spiritually and literally from the famine that's about to come. Okay, I hope I made a compelling argument there about how to try and take a different tack on the informers' reports and on the archives more generally from a study of religions perspective.
Oh, thank you. Personally, I find it fantastic. So yeah, I'm delighted. I'm absolutely certain that Anka will have questions to ask you, more details. And before she chips in, I have a kind of dummy question that I think, because I think what you said about how to read the archives is just fascinating, and of course very useful for me, and I'm sure for everyone. Can you take us again through what you described briefly as the constructivist turn of Foucault and Derrida and the material turn? How does, can you say again in very simple term how it was before and how it is now, and how it has changed the way we can read these archives?
Okay, so the materialist turn, as I said, came about through kind of archaeological studies and anthropology, and it's was not explicitly, so scholars that deal with kind of material culture and anthropology of material life and so on, are not necessarily explicitly attacking that discursive approach to archives, because they are usually dealing with lived communities. They're out there doing field work and so on. So those kind of material approaches. However, if you look at the critiques of anthropology itself, was on the back foot through kind of much of the 90s, precisely because of the influence of Foucault and Derrida, how everything is sort of entangled in discourses, and if you need to understand how power operates, it's all contained within the discourse. You read the text and the discourse will explain the operation of power. The material turn critiques that and says, yeah, but actually people are, you know, living in their bodies, and it's not a discursive fact when people talk about there being no bread, or that they're switching their household, you know, they're buying bread and not cooking mummeliga. That's a material reality. Now, it's very difficult, obviously, historians to talk about realities in the past, but the kind of material approach would be say, okay, let's, you know, examine the agency of those material aspects of life as they're revealed through those texts or photographs or whatever other traces might be there. So it's taking seriously the fact that if it's cold outside and there's no fuel, that impacts on how life was, you know, and that's the critical thing. And, you know, if people are in a room together and they describe or observe or take account of, you know, a kind of group dynamic that's in a space, that we remember spaces. And I think that's important. I mean, we can get into we can fall into the easy trap of kind of reading these documents as if they have no relationship whatsoever. You know, that there is no referential relationship to what happened. And that is, you know, one of the things that comes through, and I think, you know, Anke and Juliana will probably remember, I myself was using these quotes, you know, about the problem of the referential relationship of, you know, reports in the archives to reality, and people reading them as if there is a referential relationship. Well, actually, I've come full circle. I'm going back to say, no, we need to return to the fact that the referential relationship is important, because, you know, the complexity, the multivocality, and those traces of materiality point us towards the fact that this is not made up, you know, kind of simply, you know, made up within this strict ideological frame. It is actually really, really important sort of record that we can read to kind of sort of not necessarily to undermine, but to complement, if you like, the discursive approach to the way that religion was constructed within the communist era.
Thank you. Fantastic.
That's an answer. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Anke, of course.
I heard bits and pieces of this presentation, and I know James struggled with it for a lot of time. I think it was the first time we met in Cork that he introduced one of these examples with food. So I know he's thinking a lot from a long time now about this. What I would be interested in is a comparison with today, because there's an aspect of hoarding. They do it because they are awaiting the end of the world, and there is an external factor that is making them do it. I mean, there's a regime change and there's pressure on them, and then the Satan has arrived and they are waiting for the end of the world. Yeah. And they start hoarding food, and I guess the secret police is in itself trying to find where are these hoarders, because the food is scarce anyway, so you need to bring it back, so you need to punish these guys. But this is happening today as well with the pandemic and all these guys rushing into shops and buying a lot of food that is suddenly going to finish, and we need it to survive until either this passes or it's the end of the world. And I know you can't do research right now, except maybe on Facebook and groups like that, but it would be interesting to see these communities and how they deal with an actual end of the world situation and with in relation with food.
Thanks, Anke. That's a great kind of pointer, and what I hope to do right at the end of this piece, and I may introduce it here, is I don't have fieldwork from, you know, contemporary fieldwork, but I have some, you know, from a couple of years ago in the Republic of Moldova, and some interesting accounts of the significance of just this, of food within the community, fasting, boundary maintenance, and so on. the issue of hoarding, this is interesting. I'm reading a PhD thesis from a guy from Central European University, Lucian Skrob, and he's talking about transformations of food in Romania in the 20th century. And he's kind of arguing that it's a misnomer that there was scarcity of food in Romania, that it was more to do with the transformation of the economy and the the kind of centralized intention that people should shift to eating from canteens, to buying bread and not eating their own mamaliga. So it was to do with expectations. So the expectation was raised that our civilizational level is improving, that we can buy bread. And when bread became scarce, it made people feel that there was scarcity, but it wasn't actually per se a scarcity of food in the 1950s or 60s. Added onto this, like you say, there was this apocalyptic kind of view, and this is directly represented in the reports from the time, that we can't buy bread in our towns and cities because it's being exported to the Soviet Union. The Antichrist is hoarding the grain, and there's reports from Tulcha and Galatz. I saw a train, and on the side of the train I could see that it was grain. Griu is going all to Moscow, and all we have is Tataku, and he's going to redistribute for us our food. So they were hoarding, but the interesting thing is it was more like a flow. It was a constant flow of the food, because it was coming into the community, but then Tataku was sending it straight back out again. So people that were fasting for certain feast days were rewarded afterwards with food gifts Tataku would send if they maintained, according to the old calendar, these fasts, and they got some food. They were given to people that were in positions of, there's a count of a guy who worked in the telegraph office. So he was taking food from Tataku to his colleagues, sitting around a table, giving them nice food all the time, and then introducing, religious topics to them, saying, this is, Jesus Christ is our savior, and then, trying to open them up to a religious discourse and dialogue through the offering of food gifts, as well as this direct case of, well, we're doing it intentionally to infiltrate. And the other thing is, interestingly, the most compelling accounts of the collection of food are about fish, and they had somebody in the community that was a fisherman. And he's really important, because they don't eat any kind of meat. So every feast day, every fast day, they need vast quantities of meat. So there are stories of 50 kilos, 100 kilos of fish being kind of distributed, and how miraculously they were not being stopped by the secret police when they did that. So how Tataku was defending them. So yes, all those things are there, and I would love to be able to do some kind of contemporary field work, even if it was just a few days, to speak to people again and to understand their attitude towards the collection of food and its uses and so on. Thanks, Sanka.
Can I chip in with a related question? Actually, you're already out of time, but it's so fascinating when you said the archives help us with the present more than with the past, which I think is true too, but can you explain why, from your point of view?
From my point of view, I think, well, I was praising scholars like yourself, and many of us that have critiqued the way that the archives are being used in the present for political projects and memory projects, and that historical work, and the sort of work that complies with our understanding of what history writing should be, which again is something you've written about, it's not done so well through the archives. What's turned out to be far more powerful is this kind of understanding of the archives in the present, through all the transition justice scholarship as well, but also in memory, the transition of history to memory studies and everything. So that's what I'm getting at, and scholars of religions are the same. I don't think scholars of religions have really made very good use of the archives from a history of religions perspective. There's a Hungarian professor who wrote a book about religious studies in Eastern Europe before an actual Iron Curtain. I won't give his name, and he basically said, well, the end of the system made no difference whatsoever to the study of religions. And to me, that says it all, you know, because he just said, well, the same paradigms, the same theoretical approaches, the same methodologies are applied before and after. And that to me was just sent alarm bells ringing. Well, how can that be? Because really it was a significant difference for the communities, the people that are studying, and in terms of what we have as sources to look into the past. So yeah, that was my point really.
Jose?
Yeah, I had a question, or not a question, but a reflection, because really I like a lot your paper, and it's very close to things I have worked and I want to work again. But I have always the same problem with these materials from the archives. I wrote a little bit about this because what you say drives to me to the problem of how the materials were collected. When you are using these materials, you really need to know very good and very accurate the framework of the collection of these materials. Not only that they were collected by a informant of the police, and how really the materiality of these things were collected, and this kind of self-reflexivity about the whole materials. And it's important to me, something that has to do with which I found very difficult to find, to really understand in the archives of the secret police, and it's the chain of preservation of the materials, how they were put here and there, how they were classified once and then again, because I have found in my materials that they were always changing the way of preservation, and how they were in a file, and then in a different file, and then they were used for a different case. And I think we should think about this whole framework of collection of the materials. I don't know if you had thought about this in some way.
I mean, I've referred that quite a bit to Sonia Lerman. Just a second. Do you know Sonia Lerman's book? This one.
Yeah. Okay.
And she talks about the archival ecologies. Now, she wasn't working in secret police archives; she was working in other Soviet archives. But
yeah.
I think Sonia Lerman, Catherine Verdery, but in Romania, I mean, we're quite fortunate in the sense that the work of the Romanian Secret Police Archive, CNSAS, has done a lot to explain the constitution of different types of folders and how things were moved around. So for the Romanian archives, I think there's quite a good resource there. I don't know whether that exists in terms of the Stasi archives as well in the same way, to understand, you know, how and why certain papers got moved around. The other thing, I mean, like working on the network that I'm working on now, and as Anka said, you know, I have some of these materials from 4 years ago, and I'm still waiting now. And due to all sorts of circumstances, and not least now because of coronavirus, I have 24 Informer files waiting for me in Romania that I can't go and look at, relating to this, 24 more. And what I find interesting is the relationship between, because it's geographical as well, and you have to, I find it very helpful for myself to put people on a map and put the officer's name next to a town or a city, and try and, because otherwise it's just like, okay, another report, but actually they were sending postal letters and telegrams backwards and forwards, and different, different posts, different secret police posts in different cities had different collections of materials. And they were, in some of the archives, you find notifications, please send us the file on so-and-so, or please send us relevant reports from Informer so-and-so. And so you build up a picture of just how they were passing around, and also how they got, you know, what got selected to put in a penal case and what got deselected. And that's also sometimes very puzzling, because the penal case for the guy I'm referring to here, you know, it went through, you know, the trial, and only one example was presented of him serving as a priest after having been excluded from the monastery, one example. But the archive from 1951 is full of examples of him doing it, and none of the others were presented, you know. And so the judge actually, you know, reduced his sentence from 6 months to 3 months, saying, well, you've only given me one example of when he was saying prayers to a large gathering. I was like, well, what went wrong there? in terms of, and you know, it's also evident that, you know, the secret police in the major towns that were involved, Bucharest, Buzău, and Tulcea and Galați, were not really communicating to each other. They were professional, but, you know, perhaps they had other more cases that were greater priority or whatever. But, you know, it's not a picture of, it's a picture of chaos from that, on that side, at least.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thomas had a question. No?
Yeah, may I?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, if you try and go very quickly, because we are ready.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, a general question. That's why I would like to present it now, because when you see archives help us with the present more than with the past, you know, it means I should be more careful, because it deserves to be elaborated, because they certainly help us to orientate ourselves in the present, definitely, and we use them in order to do that. But on the other hand, you know, if I tell you that, okay, we have much better access to the Soviet archives than we used to have, and we don't understand Russia, which we should have, you know, now, which we should do much more. But Russia is surprising us more and more, even though we know the regime is very much KGB based and so on and so on. You know, there are serious objections. So I would just really, you know, ask you to rethink that and formulate it more carefully, because the basic message, I agree with you, but I would say they help us to orientate ourselves in the present. Okay, and it is in order to, you know, to be more precise. And then one very small or very basic question, actually, you know, how much, because we are all obsessed in a way by the access to the secret police archives, which we didn't have, and which is more and more extensive. But on the other hand, you know, how much can we really learn there without really parallelly studying the archives of the Communist Party? Because this was a dictatorship, and the KGB or the secret police indeed was the instrument of the party. Okay, so if you would study the documents about your topics in the party archive, how much would it change or enrich or influence your approach? That's my question. And it's a general question, because many people, we found more and more evidence for victimization, which is the case of religious groups, for example, and so on and so on and so on, okay? But we don't know too much about the dynamics of the regime, because sometimes there were more suppressed, sometimes there were more accepted, so to say, and so on and so on. So how is the overall picture, you know, questioning the story of the archive or not?
Okay, no, that's a very good question, and I agree. I agree, and I think the kind of, because of the type of communities that I work on, that I came to by doing ethnographic field work first, and then to the secret police archives. You know, my kind of intellectual sort of background is in a kind of grassroots, bottom-up kind of understanding of the dynamics of religion. I'm not really a scholar of, you know, church-state relations, and that's very hard for scholars of religions in Eastern Europe to grasp, because most of them are church history scholars or church-state relations scholars. So that's that top-down. So yes, it's very important, and I think Anka's probably done more of that kind of work in the Romanian context than I have. I think there's a difference between religious communities over different periods of time were classified in different ways, and they moved in and out of legality, you know, but there's a certain set of communities in Romania that more or less remained illegal throughout the whole period. Their designation was not so much debated as taken as kind of taken for granted. or they were allowed to exist in a limbo, like the old calendarists, allowed to exist in a limbo between legality and illegality. And they're quite, you know, they're usually not on the radar of kind of scholars that take a top-down approach. They're on the radar only really of scholars that come from the bottom up. But I take your point. It is a good point. You know, to what extent would those party archives tell us? I mean, for me, it'd be interesting. Do they really tell me why, you know, why sometimes, you know, the operations that were taking place are as ineffective as they are, or as, you know, as, yeah.
If I may, just a short example, you know, with this bottom-up and top-down approach, you can see it in the case of dissidents, you know, because most of the research initially was done from below, so to say, because people were sympathizers of the dissidents, you know, and now the perspective is questioned because we were obsessed. It's now by the dissident perspective and dissident discourse in the 90s and so on. So now the perspective is changing. So that would be maybe, that could be helpful a little bit with your
correlation. That's an interesting point to make, and it's a reverse one. So it's
yes.
it's interesting.
It's funny because for me it's the exact opposite. Like before, the history was very much top down. The history of dissidents, like before 89, it was a totally, in my understanding, it was totally a political reading of the dissidents' work, and the bottom-up position on the dissidents has come after 89, not before. So I'm thinking
yes,
the opposite from you, Tomasz.
Yeah, but it's changing, and I don't want to conclude that. I just want to inspire you, maybe how to elaborate something, you know, a little bit farther, because it's a separate discussion about the dissidents, of course. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Thomas.
Thanks so much.